After saying goodbye to my dying daughter, I walked out of the hospital with tears streaming down my face. But when I overheard two nurses whispering about my wife's shocking secret, I froze in disbelief. The fluorescent lights of Rivergate Medical Center buzzed overhead like angry wasps as I walked through those sliding glass doors for the last time. My legs felt like they were made of concrete, each step heavier than the last. Behind me, the antiseptic smell of the hospital still clung to my clothes, mixing with the scent of grief that I swear was seeping out of my pores. My daughter Ava, my sweet, brave, 10-year-old warrior, was gone. 2 years. That's how long we'd been fighting this damn disease together. 730 days of chemo sessions, blood draws, sleepless nights, and false hopes. 730 days of watching my little girl's hair fall out in clumps, watching her tiny body shrink, watching her spirit somehow stay brighter than mine ever could. And now it was over. The fight was done, and we'd lost. I could still feel the warmth of her forehead under my lips from that final kiss. Still hear my own voice, cracked and broken, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. Daddy's gonna be okay, sweetheart. Daddy's gonna be just fine. But standing there in the parking lot, leaning against the cold brick wall like it was the only thing keeping me upright, I knew those words were complete bullshit. I wasn't okay. I wasn't even close to okay. The November air bit at my face, sharp and unforgiving. Cars pulled in and out of the lot. People going about their normal Tuesday evening routines, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire world had just collapsed in room 314. How the hell could life just keep moving when mine had stopped dead in its tracks? Some guy in a BMW was arguing on his phone about a delayed meeting. A woman was checking her makeup in her rearview mirror. And here I was, trying to figure out how to breathe without my daughter in the world. That's when the anger started creeping in, hot and bitter in my chest. Where the hell had Claire been through all of this? My wife, Ava's mother, had waltzed into that hospital room 20 minutes before our daughter took her last breath. 20 goddamn minutes. After being MIA for weeks, she showed up looking like she'd rather be anywhere else, standing by Ava's bedside like she was visiting a distant relative at a nursing home. I kept replaying those final moments in my head, like some sick movie I couldn't turn off. Ava's breathing had gotten so shallow, so quiet. The machines were beeping in that steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack to our lives. I was holding her left hand, rubbing my thumb across her knuckles the way I'd done 1,000 times before. And Claire? She was standing there like a statue, arms crossed, checking her watch. No tears. No words of comfort for Ava. No hand on my shoulder. Nothing. When the monitors finally went flat, when that terrible, endless beep filled the room, I completely fell apart. I'm talking ugly crying, the kind that makes your whole body shake. But Claire? She just stood there, dry-eyed and distant, like she was watching someone else's tragedy unfold on a TV screen. The nurses had to gently pull me away from Ava's bed, but Claire had already stepped back, already pulling out her phone. "I need to make some calls," she'd said, her voice flat and businesslike. "Make some calls." Our daughter had just died, and she needed to make some calls. I stared at her like she'd grown a second head, but she was already walking toward the door, phone pressed to her ear. That's when something inside me cracked wide open. Not the grief that had been building for months, preparing me in its twisted way for this moment. This was something else entirely. This was the sickening realization that the woman I'd been married to for 13 years, the woman who was supposed to be my partner in this nightmare, had become a complete stranger. I thought about all those nights I'd spent in that uncomfortable hospital chair, holding Ava's hand through fever dreams and panic attacks. All those days Claire had been working remotely from her sister's place in Denver, too busy to visit more than once a week. All those times I'd made excuses for her, told myself she was just processing grief differently than I was. Maybe some people pulled away when things got tough. Maybe that was her coping mechanism. But standing there in that hospital room, watching her scroll through her contacts while our daughter's body was still warm, I knew it was more than that. This wasn't grief or different coping styles or work stress. This was something cold and calculated and wrong. The parking lot was almost empty now. Most of the day's shift workers had gone home to their families, their normal lives, their kids who were still breathing. I pulled out my keys, but my hands were shaking so bad I dropped them twice before I could get them in the lock. The sound of metal hitting pavement echoed off the concrete walls, sharp and final. I sat in my truck for what felt like hours, engine running, heat blasting, but I couldn't stop shivering. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ava's face. Not the sick, pale version from the hospital, but the real Ava. The one who used to sneak into our bed at dawn and whisper, "Daddy, let's make pancakes." The one who drew pictures of our family with purple crayon and stuck them on the refrigerator. The one who called me her best friend and meant it with every fiber of her being. That little girl deserved better than this. She deserved a mother who showed up. She deserved parents who were united in loving her, fighting for her, grieving for her. Instead, she got me stumbling through this alone while Claire played whatever sick game she'd been playing for months. I finally drove home to our empty house on Maple Avenue, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Not yet. Not to face Ava's empty room and Claire's lies and the suffocating silence of a home without laughter. So I sat in the driveway, watching the windows of our neighbors' houses glow warm and yellow in the darkness, and I made myself a promise. I was going to find out what the hell Claire had really been doing while our daughter was dying. And when I did, there was going to be a reckoning. 3 days had passed since Ava died, and I still couldn't wrap my head around eating actual food. The thought of chewing, swallowing, pretending like my body needed fuel when my soul felt completely hollowed out. It seemed impossible. But my sister Lila had been calling every hour, nagging me about taking care of myself, and I figured I should at least try to keep up appearances. So there I was, standing outside the hospital cafeteria like some kind of lost ghost, staring at the menu board without really seeing it. The cafeteria was buzzing with the usual afternoon crowd, doctors grabbing quick coffees between surgeries, families picking at sandwiches they couldn't taste, visitors looking shell-shocked and overwhelmed. The whole place smelled like overcooked vegetables and industrial-strength disinfectant, which should have turned my stomach, but honestly, I couldn't feel much of anything anymore. I was running on autopilot, going through the motions of being a functioning human being while my insides felt like they'd been scooped out with a rusty spoon. I'd been coming back to the hospital every day since Ava passed, even though there was no real reason for it. Maybe I was hoping to feel closer to her somehow, or maybe I just couldn't face going home to that quiet house where her laughter used to echo off the walls. Either way, I found myself wandering these hallways like some kind of broken-down specter, not really sure what I was looking for, but unable to stay away. That's when I heard them. 2 nurses walking past me, their scrubs rustling softly as they moved. They were talking in those hushed, careful tones that hospital workers use when they're discussing something they probably shouldn't be discussing in public. Usually, I wouldn't have paid attention. Hell, 3 days ago, I wouldn't have even noticed them. But something about the way they glanced in my direction made my ears perk up. I still can't believe she had the nerve to show up at the end like that, the first one was saying. She was older, maybe in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. I'd seen her around the pediatric ward before, one of those veteran nurses who'd probably seen everything twice. Right? After being gone for weeks, the second nurse replied. This one was younger, probably fresh out of nursing school, with tired eyes that looked like they'd seen too much too fast. I mean, I get that people grieve differently, but come on. They were walking slowly, and I found myself drifting along behind them, pretending to study the vending machines while straining to catch their words. Something cold was starting to settle in my stomach, a feeling I couldn't quite name, but didn't like one bit. She only came back because her boyfriend insisted, the older nurse continued, her voice dropping even lower. Can you believe that? Poor man still doesn't know. The words hit me like a physical blow. Boyfriend? What the hell were they talking about? I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs like it was trying to break free. These nurses were talking about someone's boyfriend, someone who didn't know something important. But who were they? He thinks she was caring for her dying daughter, the younger nurse said, shaking her head sadly. But she was living in another city for weeks. With the other man. The world tilted sideways. The fluorescent lights overhead suddenly seemed too bright, the sounds of the cafeteria too loud, the smell of industrial coffee too sharp. I grabbed onto the nearest wall for support, my legs suddenly feeling like they might give out from under me. Living in another city. With another man. While caring for her dying daughter. They had to be talking about Claire. There was no other explanation that made sense. The timeline, the circumstances, the fact that they glanced my way when they started talking, it all added up to a picture I desperately didn't want to see. I can't imagine lying to someone like that, the younger nurse was saying as they walked away. Especially when their child is dying. What kind of person does that? Their voices were fading now, getting swallowed up by the general noise of the cafeteria, but the words kept echoing in my head like some kind of sick mantra. Boyfriend. Other city. Lying. What kind of person does that? I stumbled toward the parking garage, my mind spinning like a broken carnival ride. Everything I thought I knew about the last few months was suddenly up for grabs. All those times Claire had been working remotely from her sister's place in Denver. All those video calls where she'd seemed distracted, looking off camera like someone else was in the room. All those weekends she'd claimed she was too swamped with work to come visit Ava. Had she been with him? This mysterious boyfriend these nurses were talking about? While I was sleeping in hospital chairs and learning to read Ava's vitals and holding our daughter's hand through chemotherapy sessions, had Claire been playing house with some other guy in another city? The parking garage was dim and cool, a welcome relief from the harsh hospital lighting. I made it to my truck and leaned against the driver's side door, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my keys out of my pocket. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding, some crossed wires in hospital gossip that had nothing to do with my wife. But even as I tried to convince myself it was all a mistake, pieces were clicking into place in my head. The way Claire had seemed so comfortable being away for weeks at a time. The way she'd looked almost annoyed when I'd called with updates about Ava's condition. The way she'd shown up at the hospital that final day looking like she'd rather be anywhere else, checking her watch, making phone calls. I thought about that last night. How she'd stood by Ava's bedside like a stranger visiting someone else's child. How she hadn't cried, hadn't said goodbye, hadn't even touched Ava's hand. I'd chalked it up to shock, to grief, to her way of coping with loss. But what if it wasn't grief at all? What if it was guilt? The thought made me physically sick. I'd bent over, hands on my knees, trying not to throw up right there in the parking garage. If this was true, if Claire really had been living some double life while our daughter was fighting for hers, then everything I believed about our marriage, our family, our life together was a lie. I needed answers. I needed proof. I needed to know if the woman I'd trusted with my heart had betrayed not just me, but our dying child. And if she had, God help me, there was going to be hell to pay. 13 years. That's how long Claire and I had been married. And sitting in my truck in that hospital parking garage, I couldn't figure out where the hell it had all gone wrong. 13 years of what I thought was real love, real partnership, real commitment. Now those nurses' words were bouncing around in my skull like pinballs, and every memory I had of our life together was starting to look different under this harsh new light. We met during freshman orientation at Missouri State, back when life seemed simple and full of endless possibilities. I was this quiet kid from a small town outside Springfield, more comfortable with my hands than with words, planning to study carpentry and maybe take over my dad's construction business someday. Claire was everything I wasn't: confident, magnetic, the kind of person who could walk into any room and immediately become the center of attention. She was studying marketing, had this infectious laugh that could make you forget your own name, and wore these vintage band t-shirts that somehow looked like high fashion on her. I still remember the exact moment I fell for her. It was at some stupid icebreaker event where they made us play charades with random partners. Claire got paired with me, and when she had to act out Gone with the Wind, she launched into this over-the-top Southern Belle performance that had the entire room cracking up. But when she looked at me afterward, flushed and grinning, she winked like we were sharing some private joke. That was it for me. Game over. For 4 years, we were inseparable. She was the social butterfly who dragged me to parties and concerts and late-night adventures I never would have gone on alone. I was the steady one who made sure she ate actual meals during finals week and didn't spend her entire paycheck on vintage clothes she'd wear once. We balanced each other out perfectly, or at least that's what I thought at the time. After graduation, we moved in together in this tiny apartment above a pizza joint in Kansas City. The place was a dump. The heater barely worked. The neighbors were loud as hell, and you could smell pepperoni 24/7, but we were happy. Claire landed a job at a small advertising firm, and I started working for a local contractor who specialized in historic renovations. We'd spend our evenings planning our future, talking about the house we'd buy someday, the kids we'd have, the life we'd build together. We got married 2 years later in Claire's hometown in Iowa. Nothing fancy, just a simple ceremony in her family's backyard with maybe 50 people. Her mom had strung up these white lights in the oak trees, and Claire wore her grandmother's wedding dress that she'd had altered to fit. I wore the only suit I owned and felt like the luckiest guy alive. During our first dance, she leaned up and whispered in my ear, "This is just the beginning, Mason." I believed her completely. We bought our house on Maple Avenue 3 years after that, a modest 2-bedroom place with blue siding and a front porch that needed some work. It wasn't much to look at, but it was ours. I spent weekends fixing the creaky floors and updating the kitchen, while Claire painted the walls bright colors that should have clashed, but somehow worked perfectly. We planted a garden in the backyard and adopted a golden retriever mix named Buddy, who had more energy than both of us combined. For a while, everything was exactly what I dreamed it would be. Claire got promoted at work and started making decent money. I went freelance and built up a solid reputation around town for quality craftsmanship and fair prices. We took weekend trips to little towns we'd never heard of, tried new restaurants, went to concerts at venues that held maybe 200 people. Life was good. Life was simple. Life made sense. Then we started trying for kids, and everything got complicated fast. Month after month of negative pregnancy tests. Doctor visits that led to more doctor visits. Procedures that hurt and cost money we didn't really have and didn't work anyway. Claire started getting obsessed with fertility websites and ovulation calendars and organic this and hormone-free that. I tried to be supportive, but honestly, watching her turn into someone I barely recognized was scary as hell. After 3 years of trying, we were both pretty much at our breaking point. Claire had gotten angry and bitter, like the universe was personally screwing her over. I was just tired. Tired of the scheduled sex and the constant disappointment, and the way Claire looked at happy families like they'd stolen something that belonged to her. We'd started talking about adoption, or maybe just accepting that kids weren't in the cards for us. That's when Claire got pregnant with Ava. I'll never forget the day she showed me that pregnancy test. I was in the garage, working on a rocking chair I was building for our neighbor's new baby, when Claire came bursting through the door with tears streaming down her face. For a second, I thought something terrible had happened. Then she held up that little plastic stick with the 2 pink lines, and my whole world shifted. Ava was born on a Tuesday morning in March after 16 hours of labor that had me more terrified than Claire seemed to be. When the doctor placed that tiny, wrinkled, perfect little person in my arms, I completely lost it. I'm talking full-on ugly crying, the kind that makes nurses hand you tissues and pat your shoulder sympathetically. Claire was exhausted but glowing, and when she looked at me holding our daughter, she smiled like she used to back in college. "She's going to be Daddy's girl," Claire said, her voice hoarse from all the pushing and yelling. "Look how she's staring at you." She was right. From day one, Ava and I had this connection that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. She'd calm down instantly when I held her, sleep better when I sang to her, light up like a Christmas tree when I walked into a room. Claire used to joke that I'd stolen her daughter's heart before she even had a chance to compete. For 10 years, we were happy. Really, genuinely happy in a way that felt sustainable and real. Ava filled our house with laughter and chaos and the kind of pure joy that makes you understand why people have kids in the first place. Claire seemed to find her groove as a mom, throwing elaborate birthday parties and volunteering for school committees and documenting every milestone with approximately 10,000 photos. But then came the diagnosis, and everything started falling apart. Looking back now, with those nurses' words echoing in my head, I could see the cracks that I'd been too scared or too stupid to notice at the time. The way Claire started pulling away almost immediately. The way she seemed more angry than heartbroken. The way she'd started talking about needing space, needing time, needing something I apparently couldn't give her. I'd made excuses for all of it. Grief affects people differently. Some people shut down when they're scared. Some people run away instead of fighting. But sitting there in that parking garage, I was starting to wonder if Claire hadn't been running away at all. Maybe she'd been running towards something. Or someone. The thought made me sick to my stomach, but I couldn't shake it. 13 years of marriage, and I was realizing I might not have known my wife at all. The more I thought about it, the more pissed off I got. Sitting there in my truck, going over the last few months in my head, I started seeing Claire's so-called grief response for what it really was. a carefully orchestrated disappearing act that left me holding the bag while our daughter fought for her life. It started about 6 weeks after Ava's diagnosis, right when the chemo treatments were getting really brutal. Up until then, Claire had been present, or at least physically present. She'd sit in those uncomfortable hospital chairs, scroll through her phone, make small talk with the nurses. But she always seemed restless, like she was itching to be anywhere else. I chalked it up to the stress of watching our kid go through hell, but now I'm wondering if she was already planning her escape route. The first time she mentioned needing space to process, I actually felt sorry for her. We were in the hospital cafeteria, picking at some sad excuse for a turkey sandwich, and Ava had just finished a particularly rough round of treatment that left her throwing up for hours. Claire looked exhausted, her makeup smudged and her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "I can't do this anymore, Mason," she'd said, staring at her untouched food. "I need some distance to figure out how to cope with all this." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand, thinking I was being the supportive husband. "Whatever you need, babe. Maybe you could stay with your sister for a few days? Clear your head." The relief that flashed across her face should have been my first clue. Normal people don't look relieved when they're talking about taking a break from their dying child's bedside. But I was so focused on keeping everything together, so desperate to believe we were still a team, that I missed the warning signs completely. Within a week, Claire had packed 2 suitcases and headed to Denver to stay with her sister Emily. She said she'd work remotely for a while, maybe a couple of weeks, just until she could get her head straight. Emily was supposedly going through a rough divorce and could use the company anyway. It all sounded reasonable at the time. Hell, it sounded downright noble. 2 sisters supporting each other through difficult times. But those couple of weeks turned into a month, then 6 weeks, then 2 months. And meanwhile, I was practically living at Rivergate Medical Center, sleeping in that torture device they called a reclining chair, learning the names of every nurse on the pediatric oncology floor, and becoming an expert on Ava's medication schedule. Claire would FaceTime maybe 3 times a week, always at weird hours when Ava was sleeping or getting treatment. She'd ask how things were going in this distant, polite way, like she was checking in on a sick neighbor instead of her own daughter. When Ava was awake and wanted to talk to her mom, Claire always seemed distracted, her eyes darting off screen like she was watching TV or something. "Tell mommy about the art therapy class." I'd encourage Ava, trying to keep the conversation going. "We made clay elephants today," Ava would say, holding up her creation with the kind of pride that only a sick kid can muster. "Mine has a really long trunk." "That's nice, sweetie," Claire would respond, but her tone was flat, disinterested. "Listen, I've got a work call in a few minutes, so..." Every single conversation ended the same way. Work calls, meetings, conference calls with clients. Always something more important than talking to her daughter, who was fighting cancer. But I made excuses for her, even to myself. Remote work was demanding. Emily was going through a tough time. Claire was dealing with her grief differently than I was. My sister Lila saw right through it, though. She'd come by the hospital a couple times a week, bringing homemade soup and clean clothes and a healthy dose of reality that I wasn't ready to hear. "Where the hell is Claire?" she'd ask, not even trying to keep the irritation out of her voice. "Ava asks about her constantly, and you keep making excuses for why mommy can't be here. She's processing this differently than we are," I'd say, repeating the line I'd been feeding myself for weeks. Some people need space when they're dealing with trauma. Lila would give me this look like I was the biggest idiot on the planet. Space from what, Mason? From being a mother? From supporting her husband? From being there for her sick child? I'd get defensive, tell Lila she didn't understand, that everyone grieves differently, that Claire was doing the best she could under impossible circumstances. But late at night, when Ava was finally sleeping and the hospital was quiet except for the constant beeping of machines, I'd wonder if my sister was right. The thing that really got to me was how easily Claire seemed to adapt to being away. When we first got married, she couldn't stand being apart from me for more than a day or 2. She'd call constantly when I had to travel for work, text me pictures of what she was making for dinner, complain about how empty the house felt without me. But now, she seemed perfectly content to be hundreds of miles away while our family was falling apart. And the video calls got weirder as time went on. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of what looked like a pretty nice apartment in the background. Definitely not Emily's cramped place that I remembered from Christmas visits. Other times, Claire would be wearing clothes I'd never seen before, expensive-looking stuff that wasn't her usual style. When I asked about it, she'd get vague and change the subject. "Emily's been taking me shopping," she'd say. "Retail therapy, you know? It helps me cope." But the Claire I married had never been into retail therapy. She was practical about clothes, bought what she needed and nothing more. This sudden interest in designer blouses and fancy jewelry didn't make sense, but I was too exhausted and overwhelmed to push the issue. The worst part was watching Ava's face during those video calls. My daughter would light up whenever Claire's face appeared on the screen, chattering about her day and her treatments and the nurses she liked and the food she hated. But I could see the confusion in her eyes when Claire would cut the conversations short, the disappointment when days would go by without any contact at all. "When is Mommy coming home?" Ava asked me one night after a particularly brief and unsatisfying phone call. "Soon, sweetheart." I lied, stroking her bald head where her beautiful brown hair used to be. "Mommy just needs a little more time." But deep down, I was starting to wonder if Claire was ever coming home at all. And now, sitting in this parking garage with those nurses' words echoing in my head, I was realizing that maybe she'd already found a new home. With someone else. That night, I couldn't bring myself to go home. The thought of walking into that quiet house, seeing Ava's empty bedroom, facing all those spaces where her laughter used to live, it felt impossible. So instead, I drove back to the hospital and talked my way past security, telling them I'd left something important in my daughter's room. Which wasn't exactly a lie, because I had left something important there. I'd left pieces of my heart scattered all over that sterile little space. Room 314 was dark when I slipped inside, but the hallway light filtered in just enough for me to see everything exactly as we'd left it. The bed where Ava had spent her final days was stripped down to the plastic mattress, but somehow her presence still filled every corner. Her stuffed giraffe, the one she'd named Gerald after some cartoon character I couldn't remember, was still sitting on the windowsill where I'd placed it that morning. The nurses had been kind enough to leave it behind, probably figuring no parent should have to decide what to do with their dead child's favorite toy in the immediate aftermath of losing them. I picked up Gerald and sank into that god-awful reclining chair that had been my home for the better part of 2 years. The thing was covered in some kind of industrial-grade vinyl that was supposed to be easy to clean, but mostly just felt like sitting on a park bench in the rain. I'd spent countless nights in that chair, watching Ava sleep, monitoring her breathing, jumping up every time one of her machines started beeping. Now it just felt empty and cold, like everything else in my life. My phone buzzed on the little rolling table next to the bed. Claire's name flashed on the screen, and for a second, I just stared at it. Part of me wanted to answer, to scream at her, to demand an explanation for where the hell she'd been while our daughter was dying. But a bigger part of me wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Not when I was still trying to process what those nurses had said. Not when I was still hoping there was some innocent explanation for everything. So I let it ring and went back to holding Gerald, this ridiculous stuffed animal that still smelled faintly like the lavender lotion Ava used to put on her hands when the chemo made her skin dry and cracked. It was funny how something so simple could hold so much of a person. Gerald had been Ava's constant companion through every hospital stay, every procedure, every sleepless night when the pain was too much to bear. He'd absorbed more tears than any stuffed animal should have to, witnessed more suffering than any toy was designed for. Instead of dealing with Claire's call, I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through photos of Ava. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, documenting every stage of her short life. There she was as a newborn, tiny and wrinkled and perfect, sleeping in my arms while I looked like I'd been hit by a truck. There she was taking her first steps, chasing Buddy around the backyard, covered in finger paint from some art project that had gotten completely out of hand. My favorite picture was from her 8th birthday, about 6 months before the diagnosis. We'd thrown her a princess party in the backyard, complete with a bounce house and enough pink decorations to blind a person. Ava was wearing this elaborate dress-up gown that Claire had found at some vintage shop, complete with a plastic tiara that was probably worth about 50 cents, but made her feel like royalty. In the photo, she was mid-laugh, her mouth wide open, her eyes sparkling with pure joy. That was Ava in a nutshell, pure, uninhibited happiness that could light up a room. I scrolled past dozens of birthday photos to the harder ones. Ava in her hospital bed, bald as an eagle but still smiling for the camera. Ava giving a thumbs up after a particularly brutal chemo session, trying to look brave even though I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Ava asleep with Gerald clutched to her chest, so tiny and fragile that she looked like she might disappear if someone breathed on her too hard. The thing that killed me about all these photos was how few of them included Claire. Oh, she was there for the big moments. Birthdays, holidays, school events. But looking back through 2 years of cancer treatment, she was basically a ghost. It was like she'd started disappearing from Ava's life long before she physically left for Denver. There was one video I couldn't bring myself to delete, even though watching it felt like sticking a knife in my chest and twisting it. Ava had recorded it herself about 3 weeks ago, during one of her better days when the nausea wasn't too bad and she had enough energy to be silly. She'd figured out how to use the camera on my phone and had made this goofy little movie of herself singing some pop song I didn't recognize. "Hi, Daddy," she said to the camera, waving Gerald's little hoof at the lens. "Gerald and I are making a music video for you because you look sad all the time and we want to make you smile." What followed was the most off-key, ridiculous, beautiful performance I'd ever seen. Ava belted out this song about friendship and love and never giving up, using Gerald as a backup dancer and making up half the words as she went along. She was completely unself-conscious, completely in the moment, completely alive in a way that made you forget she was sick at all. "We love you, Daddy," she said at the end of the video, blowing a kiss at the camera. "Even when you're grumpy and need to shave your face." I must have watched that video 50 times over the past few weeks, and it got me every single time. Not just because it was probably the last video I'd ever have of Ava being truly happy, but because of what she didn't say. She didn't mention missing her mom. She didn't ask when Mommy was coming home. She didn't seem confused or hurt by Claire's absence. It was like she'd already accepted that it was just going to be the two of us against the world. Maybe that should have been my wake-up call. Maybe I should have realized that a 10-year-old kid doesn't just stop asking about her missing parent unless something is seriously wrong. But I was so focused on keeping Ava comfortable and fighting her disease that I missed the bigger picture. I was so busy trying to be both parents that I didn't stop to think about why I had to be both parents in the first place. Now, sitting in that empty hospital room with Gerald in my lap and those nurses' words echoing in my head, I was starting to understand. Ava had been protecting me. My dying daughter had been trying to shield me from the truth about her mother because she could see what I was too scared or too stupid to acknowledge. Claire hadn't been grieving or processing or coping with trauma. She'd been living another life entirely. And somehow Ava had figured it out long before I did. The thought made me sick. Ava had spent her final months not just fighting cancer, but carrying the weight of her mother's betrayal. A 10-year-old kid shouldn't have to worry about protecting her father's feelings. A 10-year-old kid shouldn't have to be the strongest person in the room while she's literally dying. But that was Ava. Even at the end, even when she was too weak to lift her head off the pillow, she was still trying to take care of everyone else. She deserved so much better than what she got. She deserved parents who showed up, who fought for her, who put her needs above everything else in the world. She deserved better than Claire. And honestly, she probably deserved better than me too. But at least I'd been there. At least I'd tried. At least I'd loved her with everything I had until the very last second. I stayed in that room until the morning shift arrived, holding Gerald and making myself a promise. I was going to find out exactly what Claire had been doing while our daughter was dying. And when I did, there was going to be hell to pay. I left the hospital that morning feeling like a man possessed. Those nurses' words had lit a fire under me that I couldn't put out, and I was done making excuses for Claire's behavior. If she'd been living some kind of double life while our daughter was dying, I was damn well going to find out about it. The days of giving her the benefit of the doubt were officially over. The first thing I did when I got home was dig out our joint credit card statements. Claire handled most of our finances, said she was better with numbers than I was, which was probably true. I was more of a pay the bills and hope there's money left over kind of guy. But I still had access to our online accounts, and it didn't take long to pull up months' worth of transactions that told a story I really didn't want to read. Holy shit. The evidence was right there in black and white, and I couldn't believe I'd been stupid enough to miss it. Starting in late August, right around the time Claire had gone to support her sister Emily, there were charges I couldn't explain. Hotel bills in Phoenix. Expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of. Spa treatments, shopping sprees, plane tickets purchased under her maiden name instead of our married name. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through page after page of charges that painted a picture of someone living it up while I was sleeping in hospital chairs and counting out pills for our dying daughter. There was a charge for some fancy steakhouse in Scottsdale on the same day Ava had been so sick from chemo that she couldn't keep water down. A spa day in Phoenix that cost more than our mortgage payment, purchased while I was researching experimental treatments and begging insurance companies to cover procedures that might save our kid's life. But the real kicker was the recurring charges to some upscale apartment complex in Phoenix. Monthly rent payments that started in September and continued right up until this week. Claire wasn't staying with her sister in Denver. She was shacked up in some luxury apartment in Arizona, and from the looks of these credit card bills, she wasn't living there alone. I felt like I was going to throw up. All those times she'd called from what I thought was Emily's couch, complaining about how cramped the apartment was and how hard it was to focus on work with Emily's kids running around. All those video calls where she'd been wearing clothes I didn't recognize, standing in front of backgrounds that looked nothing like Emily's place. She'd been lying to my face for months while I was watching our daughter waste away. The apartment complex was called the Meridian, and their website made it look like something out of a magazine. Luxury 1- and 2-bedroom units with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances and views of some golf course that probably cost more to play than most people made in a month. The kind of place Claire had always talked about wanting to live in someday, back when we were young and stupid and thought we'd eventually have money for that kind of lifestyle. I called the complex, my heart hammering so hard I was surprised the receptionist couldn't hear it through the phone. I figured they wouldn't give me any information, but I had to try. "Hi, I'm trying to reach my wife, Claire Morrison," I said, using her maiden name since that seemed to be her preferred alias these days. "She's been staying in one of your units, and I need to get in touch with her about a family emergency." "Let me check our records," the woman said, and I could hear her typing in the background. "Oh yes, Mrs. Morrison in Unit 247. But I show that she's listed as Claire Holloway on our lease agreement. Would you like me to connect you to her unit?" Holloway. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. I managed to stammer out some excuse about wanting to surprise her and hung up before I said something that would get me in trouble. But that name, Holloway, was burning a hole in my brain. It had to be connected to the boyfriend those nurses were talking about. It had to be his name. A quick Google search gave me more information than I wanted. Bryce Holloway, 34 years old, marketing director for some big corporation with offices in Phoenix and Denver. His LinkedIn profile showed a guy who looked like he'd stepped out of a men's magazine. Perfect hair, expensive suit, the kind of confident smile that probably got him whatever he wanted. His company bio talked about his innovative approach to brand management and his passion for helping businesses reach their full potential. What it didn't mention was his apparent passion for stealing other men's wives while their kids were dying. The more I dug, the sicker I felt. Bryce had been posting photos on social media all fall, hiking trips, fancy restaurant meals, weekend getaways to places that looked suspiciously like the backgrounds I'd been seeing in Claire's video calls. And while he was careful not to show anyone else in the photos, there were little clues. A second wine glass on the table. 2 sets of hiking boots by a hotel room door. A woman's hand reaching into the frame to grab something, with a wedding ring that looked exactly like the one I'd put on Claire's finger 13 years ago. I found myself staring at a photo Bryce had posted just 3 days ago, the same day Ava died. It showed an expensive bottle of champagne and 2 glasses on what looked like a hotel balcony, with the caption, "Celebrating New Beginnings." While I was holding my dying daughter's hand and promising her everything would be okay, this asshole was popping champagne with my wife to celebrate their new beginning. The rage that built up in my chest was unlike anything I'd ever felt. This wasn't just anger. It was pure, white-hot fury that made me want to drive straight to Phoenix and beat the living hell out of both of them. But I forced myself to stay put, to keep digging, to gather as much evidence as I could before I did anything stupid. I called Emily in Denver, Claire's sister who was supposedly going through a messy divorce and needed support. Emily sounded genuinely surprised to hear from me, and even more surprised when I asked how Claire was holding up. "Claire? I haven't seen Claire since Christmas," Emily said, confusion clear in her voice. "Why would you think she's here?" "She said she's been staying with you for the past few months," I managed to say, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. She said you needed support during your divorce. There was a long pause. Mason, I'm not getting divorced. And Claire definitely hasn't been staying here. What the hell is going on? I hung up without explaining, because I honestly didn't know how to put it into words. My wife had been living with another man for months while our daughter fought cancer. She'd lied about everything. Where she was, who she was with, why she couldn't be there for Ava. She'd built an entire fake life with some marketing director while I'd been fighting for our daughter's life alone. But I still needed more proof. I needed something concrete, something undeniable, something that would hold up when I finally confronted her about what she'd done. So I did something I never thought I'd do in a million years. I hired a private investigator. His name was Detective Ray Martinez, a former cop who specialized in infidelity cases. He had kind eyes and a gentle way of talking that made it clear he'd delivered this kind of bad news before. When I explained what I suspected, he just nodded and told me he'd have answers within a week. I'm not going to lie to you, Mr. Patterson, he said as I wrote him a check I couldn't really afford. Based on what you've told me, this doesn't look good. But you deserve to know the truth, especially after what you've been through with your daughter. A week later, Ray called me back. His voice was quiet, professional, but I could hear the sympathy underneath. I've got photos, Mr. Patterson, and financial records, and witness statements. Your wife has been living with Mr. Holloway for 4 months. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but there's no doubt about what's been going on. The photos he showed me an hour later told the whole sick story. Claire and Bryce holding hands as they walked into their apartment building. Claire and Bryce at romantic dinners while I was spoon-feeding Ava when she was too weak to eat on her own. Claire and Bryce at some resort in Sedona, laughing and kissing like newlyweds, while I was sleeping in a hospital chair and wondering if my daughter would live through the night. The final photo was dated 3 days ago, the day Ava died. It showed Claire and Bryce walking out of that fancy apartment building together, her suitcase in his hand, both of them looking relaxed and happy. She was heading back to play the grieving mother for exactly long enough to get through Ava's death, and then she was going right back to her new life with her new man. I stared at those photos until my vision blurred, and I finally understood what those nurses had been talking about. Claire hadn't been grieving. She hadn't been processing trauma or needing space to cope. She'd been playing house with another man while our daughter died, and she'd only come back because he'd probably insisted she needed to keep up appearances. My daughter had deserved so much better than this, and it was time Claire paid for what she'd done. 3 days before Ava's memorial service, I was ready for war. I'd spent the better part of a week gathering evidence, staring at photos that made me sick to my stomach, and planning exactly what I was going to say when Claire finally came home to face the music. The private investigator's manila envelope sat on our kitchen table like a loaded gun, stuffed with proof of everything she'd done while our daughter was dying. I didn't have to wait long. Claire came through the front door around 9 that evening, looking like she'd just stepped off the pages of some fashion magazine. New haircut, expensive clothes I'd never seen before, makeup perfectly applied like she was heading to a business meeting instead of coming home to deal with our dead child's affairs. She moved through our house like a stranger, setting down her designer purse and checking her phone before she even acknowledged I was there. "Hey," she said casually, like she'd just been gone for a weekend instead of abandoning our family for months. "I know we need to talk about arrangements for Ava. I was thinking something simple, maybe at Morrison Funeral Home. Something simple." Our daughter was dead, and Claire wanted to keep things simple so she could get back to her new life as quickly as possible. The rage that had been building in my chest for days finally reached its breaking point. Without saying a word, I picked up the manila envelope and spread Ray's photographs across the kitchen table like a deck of cards. 23 photos that told the story of Claire's secret life in perfect, devastating detail. Her and Bryce at romantic dinners. Her and Bryce hiking in Sedona. Her and Bryce walking hand in hand into their luxury apartment while I was watching our daughter's body shut down one organ at a time. Claire stopped mid-sentence when she saw the photos, her face going pale under all that carefully applied makeup. For a second, she just stood there blinking at the evidence spread out in front of her, like she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Then something shifted in her expression, and instead of the shame or remorse I'd been expecting, I saw something else entirely. Relief. "Well," she said, letting out a long breath and sinking into one of our kitchen chairs. "I guess that's out in the open now." That was it. No tears, no apologies, no desperate explanations. Just a casual acknowledgement, like I'd caught her eating the last piece of cake instead of destroying our family. I stared at her, waiting for something more, but she just sat there looking at the photos with mild interest, like she was flipping through a vacation album. That's all you have to say? I managed to get out, my voice sounding strangled even to my own ears. Our daughter just died, Claire. Our daughter died while you were playing house with this asshole. She shrugged, actually shrugged, and looked up at me with eyes that belonged to a complete stranger. You weren't enough anymore, Mason. This whole situation, Ava's illness, the constant hospital visits, the grief, I wanted more than that. I wanted to feel alive again. The words hit me like physical blows. I gripped the back of my chair to keep from falling over, trying to process what I was hearing. This was the woman I'd been married to for 13 years, the woman who'd held our daughter as a baby and promised to love her forever. And she was talking about Ava's cancer like it was an inconvenience that had cramped her style. You had a daughter, Claire, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. A daughter who needed her mother. A daughter who asked about you every single day while you were off screwing your boyfriend. For the first time since she'd walked through the door, something flickered across Claire's face. But it wasn't shame or regret. It was irritation, like I was being unreasonable for bringing up our dead child. She was your daughter more than mine, Claire said, her voice getting harder with each word. You were the one who lived in that hospital, who knew all the nurses' names, who understood her medication schedule. You chose to make that your whole world. I chose differently. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Claire was sitting there in our kitchen, surrounded by evidence of her betrayal, talking about our dying daughter like she'd been some kind of burden that had interfered with her happiness. The woman I'd fallen in love with in college, the woman who'd cried when Ava took her first steps, had turned into someone I didn't recognize at all. I wanted to feel alive, she continued, picking up one of the photos and studying it like she was admiring her own performance. Bryce makes me feel like myself again. He doesn't see me as just a cancer mom or a grief-stricken wife. He sees me as a woman with desires and dreams and a future. The casual cruelty of her words left me speechless. While I'd been holding Ava through chemotherapy sessions and reading her stories when she couldn't sleep and promising her that mommy would be home soon, Claire had been building a new life with a man who helped her forget she'd ever had a daughter at all. I realized then that the woman I'd married was gone, had probably been gone for months. This person sitting across from me, calmly defending her choices while our daughter's body was still at the funeral home, was a stranger wearing Claire's face. And I was done trying to find traces of the woman I'd once loved in this cold, selfish person she'd become. 2 days after that nightmare conversation with Claire, I couldn't put off the inevitable anymore. Ava's room had been sitting untouched since the day she died, like some kind of shrine I wasn't ready to disturb. But the memorial service was tomorrow, and I needed to find something of hers to display. Maybe one of her drawings, or that photo from her last birthday, where she was wearing that ridiculous tiara and grinning like she owned the world. I pushed open her bedroom door and immediately got hit with that smell that was purely Ava, strawberry lip balm, the lavender lotion she used on her hands, and something else I couldn't name that was just her. Her bed was still unmade from the last morning she'd slept at home, covers thrown back like she'd just gotten up to brush her teeth. Her desk was covered with art supplies and half-finished projects she'd never get to complete. That's when I saw her diary sitting on the nightstand, a pink notebook with a cartoon unicorn on the cover that she'd been writing in religiously for the past few months. I'd never read it before. A kid deserves her privacy, even a sick kid, but something made me pick it up that day. Maybe I was hoping to find some trace of her thoughts, some piece of her I could hold on to. I flipped through pages of typical 10-year-old stuff. Complaints about hospital food, descriptions of weird dreams she'd been having, lists of movies she wanted to watch when she felt better. And then, tucked between the pages near the back, I found a folded piece of notebook paper with "For Daddy" written on the outside in her careful handwriting. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it, and when I read the first line, I had to sit down on her bed before my legs gave out. Dear Daddy, asterisk. I know I'm sick and maybe I won't be here long, but please don't be sad forever. You always smiled when I made breakfast messes, even when I got pancake batter on the ceiling that one time. Remember that. Remember how we used to laugh about everything, even the dumb stuff, asterisk. And don't let mommy make you feel bad about anything. I think she loves someone else now, but that's not your fault. You're still the best daddy in the whole world. You're my best friend, and you always will be, even when I can't tell you that anymore. Asterisk. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Asterisk. Forever and always. Asterisk. Ava asterisk. I broke down completely. Right there on my daughter's unmade bed, surrounded by her stuffed animals and art projects. I cried harder than I'd ever cried in my life. She knew. My brave, beautiful daughter had figured out what I'd been too blind to see. And even while she was dying, she'd been trying to protect me from the truth. Ava had been 10 years old and fighting cancer, but somehow she'd been the strongest person in our family. The morning of Ava's memorial service, I made a decision that felt like the first honest thing I'd done in months. I wasn't going to invite Claire, but I sure as hell wasn't going to stop her from coming either. If she wanted to show up and play the grieving mother act one last time, that was her choice. But I was done pretending we were a family, done making excuses for her absence, done protecting her reputation while she'd been destroying ours. I called Morrison Funeral Home and told them to remove Claire's name from the program. Just mine and Ava's. Father and daughter. The way it had been for the last 2 years anyway. Claire showed up 20 minutes late, which honestly didn't surprise me at all. She slipped into the back row wearing a black dress I'd never seen before, probably something she'd bought with Bryce's money, and sat by herself while the rest of our family and friends filled the front rows. Nobody acknowledged her. Nobody saved her a seat. Nobody even looked in her direction. It was like she was invisible, which seemed fitting considering how invisible she'd made herself during Ava's illness. My sister Lila gave the eulogy, reading from notes she'd written about all the things Ava had loved. Art class and chocolate chip pancakes, and that stupid cartoon about talking vegetables that made her laugh until she snorted. Lila's voice cracked a few times, but she made it through without breaking down completely, which was more than I could have managed. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the front of that small chapel and looked out at all the people who'd actually shown up for Ava when it mattered. Her teachers from school, the nurses from the pediatric ward who'd become like family to us, my coworkers who'd covered for me during countless hospital stays, our neighbors who'd brought casseroles and mowed our lawn and asked about Ava every single time they saw me. Ava was light, I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected it to be. She was laughter in the darkest moments. She taught me that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make every single day. Love shows up. Love stays. Love fights for what matters, even when fighting hurts. I didn't mention Claire's name once during my speech. I didn't talk about absent mothers or broken promises or the ways adults can fail the children who depend on them. I just talked about Ava, about her courage and her kindness and the way she'd made everyone around her better just by being herself. After the service, while people were sharing stories and eating the sandwiches Lila had ordered from the deli Ava used to love, I drove straight to the courthouse and filed for divorce. No drama, no confrontation, just paperwork that would officially end what had already been dead for months. That afternoon, I donated all of Ava's favorite books to the children's ward at Rivergate Medical Center. Then I started the Ava Patterson Foundation for single parents dealing with childhood cancer, using the life insurance money that was supposed to help us rebuild our lives together. Instead, I'd rebuild my life alone and help other families avoid the isolation I'd felt during those final months. It felt right. It felt like something Ava would have wanted, turning our pain into purpose, making sure other kids didn't have to face their battles without both parents showing up to fight. 6 months later, I found myself standing behind a podium at Rivergate Medical Center, looking out at a room full of people who'd come to support the Ava Patterson Foundation's first major fundraiser. The same hospital where I'd spent 2 years watching my daughter fight for her life had become the place where her legacy was making a real difference for other families going through the same nightmare. I'd been asked to give the keynote speech, to tell Ava's story, and explain why this foundation mattered. Public speaking had never been my thing. I was more comfortable with a hammer in my hand than a microphone, but this felt important in a way that made my nervousness seem insignificant. My daughter Ava taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. It's loving someone so much that you keep fighting even when you're terrified. She was 10 years old and braver than any adult I've ever known. I told them about Ava's art projects and talked about her determination and the way she'd made friends even when every nurse made her sick ward, about her concern for other kids who were scared and alone, about the letter she'd left me that proved she was wiser than her years should have allowed. When I read her letter aloud, the entire room went silent except for the sound of people quietly crying. And when I finished, they didn't just clap. They stood up and applauded like they'd just witnessed something sacred. Because in a way, they had. Afterward, a little girl with a shaved head and the biggest brown eyes I'd ever seen came up to me and tugged on my jacket sleeve. She couldn't have been more than 7, wearing a hospital bracelet and a smile that reminded me so much of Ava it took my breath away. "Your daughter sounds like a superhero," she said in that serious way kids have when they're saying something they think is really important. I knelt down to her level and smiled for what felt like the first time in months. She was, I told her. She absolutely was. I never saw Claire again after the divorce was finalized. Last I heard, she'd moved to California with Bryce, probably starting fresh somewhere nobody knew about the daughter she'd abandoned or the husband she'd betrayed. But I wasn't bitter anymore. Anger was exhausting, and I had more important things to do with my energy. Ava's voice lived on in every child we helped, every family we supported, every parent who didn't have to face their worst nightmare alone. I still missed her every single day, probably always would, but I walked forward with her light in my heart and my head held high, knowing she'd be proud of the man I was becoming.